Thanks for joining me today with running Ruby on Rails and Docker. My name is Tyler Flint, and I'm the CEO of Nanobox. So over the last 10 years or so, I've had the fortunate opportunity to work with some of the most well-known companies, some of the largest infrastructures in the world with their cloud infrastructure and their application deployment processes. The culmination of all those experiences led us to Nanobox. So we created Nanobox with a vision that you, the application developer, can focus on code, not cloud. And so with that, I'd like to make sure that we set the tone early. This is going to be a presentation for Rails developers. It's not going to be a DevOps. We're not going to get into core, deep DevOps topics. So if you're wondering if you're in the right place, if you're a Rails dev, you're in the right place. And so ultimately, we are devs. We love to create dev workflows, and that's why we came into business, was to make devs a better version of themselves. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into Docker. So you might be asking yourself, why Docker? I'm a Rails dev. Why does that matter to me? Well, it really does matter, because even though you're focused on code and writing application features, what you really want is an application that is portable, meaning that you can run it on any cloud infrastructure without having to rewrite and reconfigure or kind of figure out how to do that. You also want an application that can scale when the amazing features that you develop are in high demand and you need to move from one instance to maybe 200. Well, also you want to be able to know what your application is doing in production, why it's doing it, and to be able to diagnose and debug quickly. We also want to make sure that our application is secure and that we have created an environment that prevents the likelihood of attacks happening. And lastly, we want to make sure that our updates are atomic. We don't want our users to have to experience some weirdness when we're trying to roll out releases. And as developers, we like to be able to release multiple times a day. So even though you're a Rails dev and you're not a DevOps developer, we really need to actually take notice of Docker, because Docker provides some workflows and some capabilities that are really incredible. But before we actually show all of those things, which we're going to show each of those things individually, but we need to have a really good understanding of how to configure Docker, at least from a thousand-foot perspective. So the most common thing that I hear when I talk to Rails devs or other application developers is that they've heard about Docker, they'd like to get into it, but they just don't know how to wrap their head around it. Like, I see this Docker file. Well, where does the Docker file go? Well, there's my source code. Well, where does my source code go? Is it like multiple repositories? Are they together? How are they together? Do I just drop a Docker file in the application? And so let's go ahead and clear that up right now. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with our Rails application. And we're going to keep this really simple, because ultimately we're trying to containerize this application. So we're going to put the Docker configuration inside of this application. So we're going to do that by creating a .docker folder. We're going to keep all the Docker configuration isolated into that folder so that we don't have it strung all over our applications. That Docker folder should be in the root of your Rails app, right alongside of your gem file or app directory. Okay, so the next thing, and this is really important, it doesn't matter what you may have heard or maybe what you have read, my experience is that your dev environment and your live environment are not the same, and that it is a mistake to try to mix them together. Even though it's the same application, the requirements in dev and the requirements in live are fundamentally different, and you end up causing yourself a lot of pain if you try to put them together. So what we're going to do is, inside of that Docker folder, we're going to isolate the two environments by creating a dev folder and a live folder. Then inside of that dev folder, that's where we will put our Docker file. Also, that's where we can put our Docker Compose file for running the application locally. And we'll talk about Docker Compose here shortly. And then for our live configuration, we'll also have a Docker file there, though it will look different than the Docker file that we use in dev. And we'll also put the platform-specific configuration file. In this case, the box file.yaml is the nanobox config file, so that's where we will put that. Okay, so with that in mind, we'll be able to jump into the configuration. At this point, hopefully we'll have, at least at this point, hopefully we've got a good grasp on why we would want to use Docker in the first place, and at least be able to have a mental model of where does the configuration belong within my application. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So let's jump right into the configuration. So just as a quick context here, I'm not going to get too far into details because this could go on and on and on. I mostly just want to show you an overview and kind of show you how things could work and really help you understand what your workflow might look like if you're using Docker. I will take this project and release it on GitHub, and also if you are interested in getting hands-on assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or the Nanobox team, and we would love to be able to help you with your Docker configuration and Docker deployment. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. I have a Rails application. I actually didn't write this Rails app. I just did a Google search and found on purpose a Rails app that someone else had developed, and I did that because I wanted to make sure that to demonstrate that any Rails app can be Dockerized. So this is a blog application that someone wrote probably for another webinar or maybe even for a conference talk. Okay, so what we've got is our Docker folder dev, and I'm going to open up the Docker file and kind of walk through this, but I'm not going to get into a lot of details. Essentially, we're going to start this image, and actually before I do this, let me just back up real quick and provide some context. The Docker file is what defines the environment within which our application will run. That's the only purpose that the Docker file serves, is to create the environment that our application will run inside of. So with that in mind, we open up our Docker file and we start by pulling the Ruby 2.3 image. And then we install the necessary packages that we're going to need in development. And then we set up the apter, which is where we're going to mount the source. And lastly, we copy the gem file, gemfile.lock, and do a bundle install. So a couple of things real quick as we're running through this. So first, we might notice that we didn't actually copy the source code, and that is because we're in the development environment. We will not copy the source code. We're actually going to mount the source code into this, into the container, so that as we make changes to the application, they'll be propagated in real time. But we are going to, we do have to copy the gem file and gemfile.lock to do a bundle install. Okay, so that's it. Really, really simple, very simple Docker file. That'll give us the environment that we need. So next, let's go ahead and look at our Docker Compose configuration. And we'll go ahead and use Docker Compose for the local development environment. It is a project that is released and maintained by Docker, and it's really nice for being able to run multiple services together in an isolated context, so you can run the entire application. So if we look in our Docker Compose file, we'll notice that we have services defined. First, we'll notice that we have a database that is defined. So a database, in this case, our Postgres database, the Rails app can connect to. So we'll go ahead and pull the Postgres image. We do need to attach a volume so that the data persists. And then we move on to define our Rails web service. The only difference here is that there's two differences. First off is that we have to provide a build because the Rails web service is actually our application. So in build, we provide the reference to the Docker file so that we can build the environment. And then also in our volumes, that's where we're going to mount the apter into /app. So what that means is it is literally going to mount this source code into the running container at /app. Then just a little bit of plumbing. We do have to bind port 3000 from our workstation to port 3000 inside of that container. That will allow us to access the application from a browser. Okay, So essentially what we've got here so far is we've got a Docker file that's going to define our development environment, and then we have a Docker Compose file which is going to tell Docker Compose how to run the development environment and what services that the web application depend on, and actually how to run it. We have I just set a couple of environment variables in the .m file just to keep things isolated from other projects. And with that, we are able to rock and roll. So now let's head over to our console and let's get our development environment up. So I'm going to use a tool called NBX. So a couple of things. One, NBX is a workflow tool that is provided by Nanobox. And the second is not required. So even though I'm going to use it here, it isn't required. Ultimately, as I'm using MBX Dev, that is an alias for Docker Compose. So you can use Docker Compose directly. I choose to use MBX because there are some helpers built into it. And also, NBX will generate the configuration for me, which this configuration that we're seeing here was generated by NBX. And so especially if I'm a Rails dev and I really don't want to worry about all that and how to configure it, I can have MBX generate that for me. If you'd like more information on that, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to set you up with MBX. It is a free and open source tool. Okay, so MBX Dev Up. So by typing MBX Dev Up, that is going to build the entire dev environment based off of the Docker file that we created, and it's going to actually start it up. And we can see here that it is running. So now if I go over to my browser and I open up a new tab at 127.0.0.1 port 3000, I can access the application. If I go back over to my terminal, I'll see that the logs are streaming as I am accessing this application. Makes it really handy for development. It's all isolated, all contained in one location. So with that, let's go and check it out. So this is a demo blog. Let's create a new blog post. And let's create a new post. Looks like we can just say Docker is cool. And why is Docker cool? Because it gives me superpowers, which is very true, and we are going to show you those superpowers here shortly. And we'll go ahead and save. Cool, there we go. So now we've got, if we go back over to our main, we can see in our list of posts, we've got the one post, I can access it. And so we have a fully contained, isolated development environment. Now I get it, not everybody's into Dockerizing a development environment, and or a lot of people tell me, hey, my development environment is just fine, why do I need another one? Well, there's no reason for you to have to switch if what you're using is comfortable and what it works. But here's one thing that I will say, there are some advantages to Dockerizing your development environment. First off, if you're if you're a bit of a clean freak like myself, I just love the notion that everything is isolated. But here is something else that I really like. So now let's say I'm done working on my application, I can go ahead and stop that, and it brings the entire application offline. So there's nothing running in the background, not even a database. Everything is done. It is cleanly isolated. Well, what if I need to run a one-off command? I can do that, and it will bring the environment right back up. So if I do mbx dev run web, I have to specify the web service, and let's just say bash. So that's going to bring the database back up, and then it's going to drop me into a container with the environment that has my source code mounted in and everything else. So I can run a Rails console, or really anything else that I would normally do from my local workstation, I can do inside of here. So there's really no difference to me except all the advantages. And just to kind of show you, I'll go ahead and run this environment up again. And now I'm going to modify the application. I'm sure I could find a view here that we can update. So posts, index. Okay, so let's say all the posts. Okay, so I've made that change. The application is up and running. Oh, it looks like we did something. Something broke here. So what did we do? Let's just make sure that we clean things up, bring it down, bring it up again. And all right, so something happened here. Not sure. Oh, it says. Oh, right. Okay, so it wasn't shut down cleanly. Okay, so this is a funny thing with Rails that they put stuff in here. So I'll clean this up. It thinks there's one running, which there's really not. Okay, so let's go ahead and start this up again. Got this development environment starting up, and there we go. Okay, so now I can refresh the application, make sure that it's running again. This time I'm going to head back over to my index, and we can see the change. So I can make changes just like I normally would. I can come back in here and undo that, make the change, and we're back in business. So really, there's no reason, there's no difference between a Docker development environment and a non-Dockerized development environment. All the advantages. But I want to show you one thing that is my absolute favorite thing about a local Docker development environment. Now, this just speaks to everything that kind of hits on all my my ticks or whatever. But I'm going to go ahead and implode this environment. I absolutely love this. This means that I'm done working on this project. Maybe I was reviewing something for a friend, and bam, it's gone. There's no evidence of this anywhere. Completely clean, no cruft, no leftover. I love that. So anyway, so those are the reasons why I prefer to do Rails development within Docker. And not only that, but if I were to run mbx dev up, it would bring everything right back up, and I'd be right back in the same spot. So that's really cool. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. So I think we've shown the local development environment. So now let's look at all of the superpowers that we could do in production. Before we do that, let's take a look at how we configure in production. So let's pop open the Docker file. First thing you'll notice is the Docker file is significantly more advanced in production. And again, this is why I go back to what I said originally. Don't try to mix your dev and live environment. It is very, very different, and it might not seem like it, but everything down to the flow is just very different. And so let me just quickly run through this. We're not going to go through all the details because it is more involved. If you want to kind of more in-depth, again, check it out on GitHub, or reach out to myself or any member of the NanoBox team, and we'd love to get you set up. Okay, so first off, here we've got a lot of meta that needs to go in. We've got to set some labels, set some arguments. We're also going to set some Rails environment variables to make sure we're running in production, logging to standard out, able to serve static files, etc. And then if you'll notice here, we install the packages, but they're significantly less than what we would run in development. Also, and if I were running this Rails app for real in production, I would not include Node.js and Yarn. I would make a couple of modifications to my gem file so that the production gems don't need a JavaScript environment. But for the sake of this demo, I'll just leave them in there. And then we run bundler, a little bit trickier because we need some packages to run the bundle install, but we don't want them in production, so we'll go ahead and install them, run the bundle, and then roll back those dependencies. Finally, we copy the app over, and we will move any configuration that is custom for the live environment on top of what was there. So let me just quickly show you if I were to open this config, I have a very different database.yaml config file. I don't want to mess up the one that's in my project, so I'm going to create a new one, put it in this Docker, put the Docker in the Docker configuration as a build artifact, and I can then copy that into this image after the source code has been copied in. It's a really, really clean way to configure your application and fine-tune it for production without having to make unnecessary changes in your source code that might break someone else's ability to run this application on their development. Okay, so with that, finally, we will precompile the assets, and and then tell Docker that when this container runs, run it with Puma and then a path to the Puma config, which we've also overloaded for production. Okay, so a couple of things real quick, just as a review. One, I understand, especially this is your first foray into Docker, this is very overwhelming. Don't feel overwhelmed. We'd love to talk to you about the MBX tool. The MBX tool actually generated this configuration for me, and it will generate the configuration for your application by looking at the requirements of your application. And then you can choose to run a dev environment or not based on that configuration. The second is that also Nanobox and the Nanobox team is available. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to talk to you, and we'd love to see what we can do to help get the perfect configuration for your organization, for your application. Okay, so now what I'd like to show is the superpowers of running in production. So just as kind of a quick reminder, why would we use Docker in the first place? Well, because it's portable, we can run on any cloud provider. Well, why don't we just see what it's like to run this on multiple cloud providers? The second is that it is scalable. Well, let's go ahead and scale it up. Let's scale one of these apps up. It's also visible. So we're going to show how we can see into that. It's secure. We'll check that out, and then also how we can apply atomic updates. So for that, we are going to use Nanobox. Now, I am biased, obviously, and so we're going to use Nanobox in part because Nanobox is very visual, but also because I happen to be impartial and believe that Nanobox is the easiest way for a Rails developer or other application developers to deploy applications across any cloud and ultimately focus on the task at hand. So I've gone ahead and created 3 deployments. That same application, I've created 3 deployments, one on AWS, one on DigitalOcean, and one on Linode. So let's go ahead and open these up. Okay, so we can see here that we have in our dashboard, we're able to kind of see this application running. Let's go ahead and look at the live application. We see that we have the application that is running live, and I've already added a post, but I have not added a post in the AWS one. So let's check this out. So this one is still wide open. But what we can see first off is, so the first superpower is portability. This is the same application that I was just showing you. It's actually running on 3 different cloud providers. It could be running on 20 cloud providers or even in your own server farm. So just by going through the effort of containerizing your application will allow a solution like Nanobox or some other open source solution that you can figure out on your own time. You would be able to run these applications on any cloud provider. Okay, well, let's look at what it looks like to make changes and to update this application. So if I were to go back, and we already kind of made a change in the source code. Maybe we undid it. Let's do it again. So let's say all the posts. All right, cool. So now with that, we're going to go ahead and push that to, which one are we looking at? AWS Rails. Let's push that one to Linode because it actually has a post. So to do that, I'm going to use the MBX tool again. This time I'm going to say MBX push, and then I'm going to reference that deployment, and it was Linode Rails. What we'll see here is that it's going to run through building the Docker image. It's going to build all that, all of that for me, compile the assets as we see here, and then it's going to synchronize this image up with that deployment. But what we're going to see here is how Docker allows us to have atomic deploys, and we'll actually see what that looks like and what I mean by that. And and I know that you'll agree when you see this play out, how nice this can be for your team and for your users who are having to consume your website or your Rails app while you're trying to push all these changes. Okay, so we're just about there, committing the new archive from sync, and as soon as that is committed, then we'll actually be able to bounce over to the dashboard. Let's make sure that we're in the right one. The Linode. Okay, so there we go. So it's actually received it. So now here's what we'll see. Because we're using Docker, what we're able to do is we're able to run a new container alongside the existing container. They're totally isolated environments, so we can run them side by side without any interference. While they're running side by side, that allows us to update the load balancer to reroute traffic to the new container, and once the traffic has been updated, then we're able to bring down the old one. So if we go here to our demo blog and refresh the page, we'll see that our change made it up. So in very, very short order, because we're using Docker, not only were we able to get a change up very quickly, but it was a very, very stable process of making that change. So hopefully, so now you've seen that the application can be extremely portable, and now you've seen how easily it is to update. Well, why don't we talk about the next superpower, which is scalability. For this one, let's hop over to our app that's running on Amazon. So what we'll actually do here is let's go ahead and say I want to move this web. Right now that's all kind of the containers are running on the same machine. Let's move it onto a horizontal cluster, and we'll keep it at the same size. Now Nanobox will allow me to pick a different size if I want to, but I'll keep it the same size. But I'm actually just going to change the number of instances to be 5. And let me go ahead and hit next. So now what's going to happen here is just a little bit of context. Nanobox is actually going to order 5 EC2 instances, get it all set up, provisioned, run Docker. Looks like we've got something here. Okay, so yeah, that'll go away here shortly. So Nanobox is actually going to get all of these set up and running for us, and then it's going to use these Docker images to spin up new containers, and you can just see how easy it is to do that. It doesn't take very long, but because we want to keep moving here quickly, let's jump over and show one of the other superpowers while we're waiting for these EC2 instances to boot up. So for this one, why don't we hop over to the DigitalOcean one, and let's take a look at how, because we have now Dockerized this application, how we're able to see our logs. So first off, because the Rails application is logging everything to standard out, if I were to go to this application, which I need to go to it, so let's go back here, open up the live view, live app. Okay. So now let me go back to my streaming logs here, and I'm going to make a couple of web requests to that application, and we'll actually see that all of those are being streamed live because the Rails app is emitting them through standard out, which Docker is capturing, and then Nanobox is able to redirect those to the logger that's running on this and pipe that up to your dashboard. So because that application is containerized, it allows us to really do some really cool things with logs, including store those in an archive for later consumption. And what about though? So the other part of visibility is how do I know how this application is performing? Well, one really cool thing that Docker does for us is, and I'm going to open up the health dashboard here on Nanobox, is every host out there is going to be able to show you your CPU, RAM, swap, and disk. But because we're running Docker, we're actually able through Nanobox to get a breakdown of all of the containers and what they're doing on that host right now. So we're able to see that Postgres is using 7%, the web is using 13%. So we have such a greater amount of visibility that we get because we're using Docker. and that allows services and platforms like Nanobox to take advantage of that. Okay, so that covers how Docker can add visibility to our list of superpowers. Now let's hop back over to scaling, and we can actually see that is done now. So because this application has been containerized and wrapped up, packaged up into an image, Nanobox was able to launch 5 EC2 instances, get them all set up and ready, and then start that container on all 5 of those images and update the load balancer to round robin between them. And we can actually see here that now we have 5 EC2 instances that's running this application. So in a very, very short order, if we were actually watching it, it takes about 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes. I was able to go from one shared server running Docker containers to, oh man, we've now got this bunch of traffic that we have to deal with, and I was able to scale up to 5 EC2 instances, and there's no upper limit on that other than what the cloud provider might impose on you. So scalability, Docker enables some really, really cool things with scalability. All right, and then the very last thing I'm going to show real quick is the security aspect. So to do that, I'm just going to quickly hop into, I'm going to console into the Docker container running the web on our Linode deployment. And we can actually see here, if we do PSAUX, that there's only the only processes that are actually running in this container are the ones for the app. And especially if you take out these bottom 2 here, because those are the ones from this login, we really only have the processes specifically directly related to running this application. I do not have access to the binaries that the host has. I don't have Docker in here. I don't have access to the host. I don't have the ability to mess things up. And so even if an attacker were to compromise somehow, there's no attack plane. There's nothing to compromise. And so at this point, because I've containerized my application with Rails, and we've used a super lightweight image, the only vulnerabilities are going to be within the application itself. And as long as you're following Rails best practices and keeping updated, then with literally no effort or very minimal effort, you're going to have a very secure production deployment. So okay, so just as a recap, why we use Docker. Just what I showed. It's so that your applications can be portable. You can run them on any cloud, and so that you can scale them as you need to, and you don't have to worry about configuring servers again. You can just scale that up. It's very visible. The visibility we have into an application running within Docker is really interesting and very, very easy to diagnose what's happening. The security inherent in just using a slimmed down Docker image is unparalleled. And then the ability to roll out updates atomically is really, really a nice experience for our users. So as a Rails developer, that's why Docker is so important. Now, I know you're all busy. I just want to thank you for taking the time to spend some time with me, and in appreciation, I just want to remind you, at Nanobox, our goal and our vision is to help you, the Rails developer, to stay focused on your application and not get diverted, not get pulled into the weeds, and not have to deal with anything infrastructure related. But we want you to be able to take advantage of all of the benefits of Docker. And so we want to talk to you. We want your business. We'd love to see how we can help your organization, and in appreciation for you taking the time out of your busy day and spending the time with me, we've created a webinar promo, Rails18. If you are interested and you talk to our sales team, just give them that promo, and that will include a free all-inclusive Docker configuration. So we will configure your application, fine-tune it, and help you get up and running on the cloud provider of your choice, so you can get back to doing what you do best, and that is Rails development. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk soon. And have a great day. We'll talk to you later. Bye.